I currently am working on a project with Media Molecule called Dreams. And I also am working on several other independent projects. And so as you can recognize, there's probably a lot of different ways that you kind of come into projects like that. And they're all very different from each other. They're all at different levels of production. And I think part of the challenge of that as a narrative designer is actually getting to grips with the new material, what can be changed, what can't be changed, what it is that people really want to make with their game, and then actually adapting yourself to being able to give it something more, polish it up, and give it direction and a kind of momentum. And that's what I think that my role is often, is actually giving the game momentum. I think that story is an excellent kind of catalyst for the rest of what is in a game. So I think that's the biggest challenge that I have, is adapting myself to that.
Yeah, so what did they give you?
So in the beginning, it can be various different things. It depends, I guess, how large scale the production is and the methods of working. I very much feel like at Media Molecule, they have a very strong creative basis and very experimental kind of basis in what they do. And so it's kind of my job to really harness the power of the other game designers, artists, audio people, and really kind of basically the first thing I did in the studio, I think, was talk to every single person in the studio that had anything to say about what they wanted from this story in the game. And then then basically I kind of wrote all of these notes down, and actually getting a good idea of what it is that they want to achieve is super important. And then you can start fleshing out the world building, putting in details. Sometimes people want lore, which is it's always quite difficult to create lore because it's a huge amount of detail and stuff that, you know, has to make sense and be consistent across the world. So there's a lot of the kind of world building process, is a lot of like actually getting to grips with what it is that people eventually want from their game, and then trying to sort of bring that out, and then trying to present to people ways in which they can put it into their area of specialization. So basically talking to the audio guys and going, how can you enhance this part of the story? Maybe it should be a very slow piece of music, or maybe it should reflect a technological element because this is the part of the story where some technology is involved, or you know, stuff like that. I think is really important, to actually listen to what people want from you, and then react to that particular thing, and actually try to, because honestly, I feel like a narrative designer's job is often to be this kind of like story administrator. Like, you're kind of this hub for all of the information, but you're also not only kind of having that information feed into you, but feed back out as well.
So when you go in, are the mechanics always set?
So some games haven't already got all of the mechanics set. I had some freedom with Dreams because not all of it's actually like a huge platform in which you can make your own game content, and so it's quite powerful. A lot of the mechanics can actually differ in that one, and so you can actually say, okay, well, if we use this game mechanic, then this will reflect this kind of story, and that's a huge blessing. But most games do actually do kind of settle on a mechanic before you start doing narrative design. And so often I'll come into a project and it will be already set. They want a specific an RPG, for example, and so that RPG mechanic will then obviously dictate exactly kind of how you can put narrative design into it, how many characters you can have, for example, what those characters can do. And yeah, there's a very specific remit that obviously comes with all of those structures. So yeah, no, I feel like most of the time the mechanics are set, and so you actually have to have a lot of meetings with game designers and try to get them on board with a story, and you also have to really absorb what it is that they're saying that they want to make. And actually that's a back and forth process that never stops throughout the whole process.
Yeah, and it can be, you know, frustrating because, I mean, mechanics then in some ways, you know, defines the story and defines, you know, how the players will be feeling, their emotional journey, all of that. And then you basically have to retrofit a story from there.
And I definitely feel like some people might feel that is very stifling, particularly if you're coming from, say, a script writing or screenwriting background, because that's quite a kind of straitjacket. But actually, once you kind of come out of linear storytelling and actually come to realize that a lot of writing in games is design, and that you will have to expand your design chops in order to be able to actually grapple with what a game means, and then your job becomes much easier. Most of what I do is not writing, it is just structure and just design. And obviously not a lot of people who make games are familiar with the language that we use to talk about story, but that's what my job is to teach and to also welcome game designers and everyone else in the studio into the story world. So a lot of that is kind of actually just a requirement now, I think. But yeah, in the beginning it did feel a bit stifling, but also I think story helps to make the mechanics make sense, if you get my meaning. And so that actually is it's actually kind of a relief to a lot of game designers when you come to the table and you say, I have a solution for like why the character would start at A and then get to B. And they're like, oh, thank God, because we thought it didn't make sense, but we really needed it to happen. And I'm so glad that you found a way, because that solution is often just like, it kind of catalyzes the rest of the game. So so it's a lot of problem solving. It's a lot of looking at constraints and then going, how can story help make this more exciting? How can it help it make more sense? How can story enhance the things that are already in here? And so, yeah, and obviously stories have a lot to say about systems, systems of oppression, systems of scarcity in particular are really interesting to me. Things like mechanics that make people feel guilty, I think, are very interesting. So yeah, all of these things are actually play into each other a lot more than people think they do, especially when you first approach storytelling as a writer.
And it's exactly what you're talking about in terms of the intrinsic motivation to do things within the actual game, and that's often, you know, your job to make sure that's happening in a compelling, meaningful way, you know, for the players. So so you know, working with that creative constraint can be really nice and work really well. But what would you like to see? You know, if you did have a magic wand and the process could be changed, what do you think would facilitate, you know, a better process?
I think personally, more time could be invested in iterating story specifically. I think a lot of the time we spend a lot of time and money on iterating game design and mechanics and those kind of the gameplay elements of the game. And I think actually a lot of the time what gets better with age and with versions, I think anyone who's worked with drafts, for example, understands that story when it first comes out of you is not as good as if you had iterated on a couple drafts, and then you kind of hone it down until it becomes really, really great. I know that Stephen King, for example, writes the whole of his book. He puts it in a drawer for 3 months, and then he takes it out and then reads it again fresh, as if he'd never seen it before. And that time, I think, is totally invaluable. However, like, a game story is finished like the day before it is released, and that is as much time as you have, and you don't have that time to kind of look at it and go, oh, this part doesn't work, or this character is excess, or can we combine these two characters? And sometimes that does happen in the process, especially if it's like a AAA game, which is like a huge development cycle. But often you don't have that time to basically kind of look back on something and go, oh man, that isn't really working. And I don't really want to go, like, a lot of the time, play, like, the motivation or the mystery, like, I think what makes players go further in a game is a couple of open mysteries that they want to solve in the story that they need to know the answers to. It's all a bit based on questions that the player has about why something has happened, or whether, like, so-and-so is going to get to so-and-so. And a lot of those things, like, sometimes they're actually missing. And if you have those missing, then people don't really want to get to the end of your game. And so, a lot of the time I think about drafts, I think about making drafts and iterating story, but I don't think that anyone would spend a lot of money iterating on story unless they were spending their own money, or they were just doing the game in their spare time.
So what so how could you envisage a team working together to iterate the story? Are there some pipeline changes that you could make?
Well, I wonder often if we could make a paper prototype of story in the beginning, which is actually a kind of pretty cheap way to look at mechanics and story. Because I think what's interesting is that just after you started, like, doing your world building and everyone's getting really excited at the beginning of the process about the story, we could pretty much, like, we could all get together, for example, and then do a kind of Dungeons and Dragons pen and paper play of an RPG world that you have just invented, and then make notes about all of the silly stories that come out of that, and try to play with, like, a couple mechanics or characters who hate each other. And I think that might actually be a really interesting solution, because it's pretty cheap. You don't need any special engine. You don't really need any you don't need any special tools. You just need a piece of paper, some pens, and enough people who are invested in your story. And you've already got that if you've done some world building. And I really recommend Fiasco. If you've never played Fiasco, you definitely have, because you're Christy. But honestly, I feel like Fiasco has really helped me several times, simply because it focuses on the relationships between characters and what that means for each scene. And that solved a lot of things for me. Sometimes when I have real game designer block, I guess you would call it, I kind of go and play or open up like a Fiasco template and think, okay, how would these two characters' scenes turn out? And so, yeah, like, I feel like pen and paper could solve a lot of the, iteration in story kind of thing for us.
Yeah, which is really nice, because it also obviously you get buy-in, and the whole team is contributing to the actual world there, but you're doing like what you can do with actors. If you're on a set, or in a theatre production, then even though the script might be somewhat locked, but then it transforms when the actors are there, and you're basically moving that to right at the beginning of the process. Yeah.
Right, and I know that Catherine Neal has talked about how difficult it is to actually visualize this whole process, and actually even further. Like, you could use, for example, you could use My Little Ponies or Games Workshop figures, or you could use Sylvanian families, you could use Lego. Any of these things, actually, they kind of, you could probably, I think, level design and build in Lego like a particular set of like puzzles that you wanted to put in your game. I think all of these things are actually really good tools for, and very cheap as well, for actually figuring out what it is that you think is valuable about a story in a game, because they don't have to be linear. And I think that we constantly think about narrative design as being a script on a page. And I think that getting away from that is actually, I think that's partly something that I'm interested in more these days, simply because I know how to write, but I don't really know how to game design very well. And I think it's like my role necessitates me being in between the two. So I think actually developing the game design brain alongside the story is something that pen and paper stuff does really well.
Yeah. Yeah, nice point. I know you've mentioned to me before also like a blue sky idea of getting riffing off what you're saying about creating the world and then putting the characters in.
Yes.
Yeah.
I mean, very few people really get to do that, although, so I think that's why DLC, for example, downloadable content that happens after a major release usually has the opportunity to be a much better story, because that is when you've let all of the designers and storytellers in the studio loose on the thing you already made. And then the remit is to make another exciting story inside the thing you already made. And so I think the reason why we get a lot of games that are really strong in the DLC area is because people have spent a couple of years working on this incredible feat of a world, and that has it starts out when they plan the 3-act structure. It's a little bit janky because they've had to finish early, or things had to change because there was a deadline. But once you've actually got that world intact and you know how it functions and you know all the rules, it's so much easier to, as you say, play around with the characters. And you kind of would go, okay, what would happen if we set this guy's house on fire or something? And there's a lot of ways in which you can play around with the all of the pieces on the board and kind of move them around. And I think that's why DLC in particular is so strong. And I think as well, Minecraft in particular was really strong because as its kind of toy box thing, it is it's definitely this kind of place where people already know the rules, and they try to maximize what they can do within those constraints. And that's such an interesting challenge. And it is for people who, have lived in that world making it for a number of years too.
Yeah, that's great. You could create a sandbox with the pillars of the core of what your project, what the game is about in terms of your some of your mechanics and theme. And then basically build it from there. Yeah, that's really interesting. So what do you recommend for us as a task for us to do now?
So I actually recommend building a world, writing down the type of most fantastical type of world you could ever imagine a game functioning in. It could be completely anything. It could be, you recently watched this series Fargo, for example, and you want to create a video game that is based in the Fargo world or universe. And then what I think is interesting is taking the world that you built and wrote down, and all of those characters that you have, and then and that pre-existing world, and then applying different video game structures to them. So RPG or JRPG or adventure game or on-rails shooter or like FPS or like a board game, for example, and take all of these styles and try and like basically try to plan out the ways in which the story that you have will actually feed into the way the game is played. I think that's a really interesting exercise, because that's often what I have to do, is like I have to kind of create a world and then be like, okay, so how do I get all of these characters and these feelings and these objects and the way that the characters will traverse the world, how do I get them to mean something to a player, and try to introduce the idea that the way that you're going about the world is saying something about you. So yeah, I think that's a really interesting challenge, and I would like to see people have a shot at it.